The workplace hasn't exactly been an ally in the cause of emotional expression. For decades, organizations stressed the importance of keeping feelings out of the workplace. Also, emotions are delegitimized beyond workplaces too. Most of our education system stresses logic and reason, as do early socialization experiences. For example, we are told you shouldn't be angry or you shouldn't be hurt by negative feedback since the others said they were just trying to help, or you shouldn't be mad at your baby brother or baby sister, whatever the case would be. Our shouldn'ts often prevent us from recognizing what we are feeling. And now, parents, with the best of intentions, still send signals that negate feelings. So, as you can see, overall, we've been raised in an environment wherein emotions are not properly recognized, and as such, it makes it difficult for us to express emotions in any interaction we find ourselves in. Now, even when people do express feelings, they tend to downplay their intensity. We conceptualize emotions, perhaps on a 10-point scale, from very mild to extreme. And not frequently, it's only when an emotion passes a threshold of, for example, 7, that people notice or report it. While low level feelings, in our case, those that are below 7, might not be worth expressing, okay? Well, like 2 or 3, we still feel them. But what about those in the mid range? 4, 5, 6, not really 7 yet, okay? Now, certain bodily responses, like things that we feel in our stomach, or a slight change in our heartbeat, we feel some palpitations perhaps, a tingling in our neck, we might often mistake it as our high blood pressure acting up. The tightness in our throat, we feel as if there's a frog preventing us from actually speaking. And even sweaty palms. They offer important clues about our emotions. Now, these responses can wake us up out of our numbness and help us recognize the severity of what's going on. Perhaps in those many years, we've tried to bottle up our emotions to the point that we are unable to really express them very well. Our bodies tend to disagree with us in our attempt to bottle things up. More often than not, though, we ignore them. Okay, we ignore these bodily signs, even when research suggests that doing so can adversely affect our health. It can make us feel worse, okay? And sometimes this would cause certain effects that would be very detrimental in the long run. This can also affect our long term happiness and even eventually the quality of our relationships. Now, our bodies, because they're sort of retaliating to what our rationality is saying, our bodies leak emotions, okay? Perhaps through how we say things or our facial expressions, okay? Which results in even more dysfunctional exchanges. So, when you're in a situation and you've noticed that there are emotions running high right now, what are our usual reactions to these emotions? Oftentimes, if we're not that mature or that well developed in managing our emotions as we recognize them, here are some of the things that you and I would probably have been doing. One, we let minor pinches build up. Small irritations, we notice it, then we let it pass. Another possibility is we just don't simply state how we're feeling. We ignore it, we bottle it up, we try to move on. Oftentimes, another approach would be if the emotions are really, really strong, we immediately go into a blame game. Okay? We blame others. We blame the weather. We blame somebody else other than ourselves. And another option that we tend to take is we don't even try to understand the other person. We don't even make an attempt to understand the other person. In which case, everything is stonewalled. We won't any make progress in our interactions. Now, these options are, was, as you might surmise, the negative ways of reacting to our emotions. However, there is obviously a more positive and productive way in actually responding or reacting to these emotions. What are they? Well, number one, if you find yourself in a tense or in a situation with a high emotional load, one approach, which is often recommended but very difficult to do, is sticking with your feelings. Go with it. Understand that you acknowledge that you're feeling this or that, okay? And work with it. In that interaction, really raise it, express it. Try to share your feelings without having to abruptly shift from anger to compassion, for example. Oftentimes, when our interactions are loaded, anger seems to be the predominant emotion. However, it's good for us to note that anger is typically a second order emotion. We are angry because of some earlier feeling, some prior feeling that actually led us to be angry. And these prior feelings, okay, are usually the more vulnerable feelings, right? The ones that we don't really want to disclose. Perhaps they're embarrassing, they're very upsetting. And yet, these things actually provide us with information. Information that if you and I, if you or the other party would just happen to know these things, then it would have been possible for you to make progress in your interaction. Such emotional openness on either part would likely be the quickest way to actually stop any growing animosity or escalation in your interaction. However, as mentioned a while ago, it can be very difficult to do, especially if you are in the heat of the moment. If the interaction is highly conflicted, that whether we like it or not, sometimes the emotions get the better of us. So while the first option, which is sticking with our feelings, exists as a possible option, it can be very, very hard to execute. Now, what are the other options? Other productive options available to us? Well, it's good for us to recognize and even try to overcome our ego traps. What are examples of ego traps? Such as refusing to apologize until the other did first. Like you'll say, I'll hold back from trying to give out my apology until he or she apologizes first. Okay. Oftentimes we think that when we admit that we're hurt can be a sign of weakness. That staying in our anger is actually a position of strength, which, as you probably know, is quite the opposite. Or sometimes we want to make the other person be or be given the image as the bad person in order for us to feel better about ourselves. Now, these are examples of ego traps. False pride locks us into a rigid stance and often leads to giving up control of what will happen. Because we are unwilling to take the initiative to actually make progress in the interaction, we lose control. We lose that sense of opportunity to actually make progress in that interaction. And whether we like it or not, even if we say that, okay, I won't apologize first before the other person apologizes, it's no guarantee that the other person will apologize. Often, we just catch ourselves by recognizing that it is our ego that's really the one that's holding us back from making any progress. Remove that ego and everything would be fine. Admitting that false pride at work is perhaps an easier thing to do compared to the first option, which is really trying to thresh out all the emotions that are existing in that interaction. Now, a third option for us to make progress in such interactions is processing what's really going on and focusing on the future. When two people are stuck or some sort of an impasse in that interaction, it is sometimes important to step back and say, hey, what's going on here? Why are we here? Can we get out of this? One of the ways that we could prevent from blame to escalate is to talk about what we really want from this relationship. It's like taking a step back in the heat of the moment, and then you ask yourselves, what do you really want to get out of this relationship? Do you still want to be in this relationship? Okay. perhaps it might be good for us to reflect on the good things from that relationship. Okay, so what are we arguing about? What are we trying to resolve here? Why do we have this conflict? Okay, now that's one way for us to make progress in our interactions and hopefully improve our erstwhile damaged relationship. Now, these three productive options, note that you can actually do more than one. They're not mutually exclusive. It's not as if you only do one, but the other two options aren't available. But you could build on one another. You could probably start with one tactic first, and then shift to another tactic, and then shift to another tactic, and perhaps go back to an earlier tactic. Okay, so it's really using these tactics to navigate the landscape of your interaction. Stepping back to look at what is going on and reminding ourselves of the relationship you'd want and miss in that relationship could lead us into more inquiry and disclosure of our own feelings. The greatest takeaway is that when you're aware of your feelings in real time, okay, sometimes it's easy for us to express these things as a regret or looking back via hindsight. Uh, but if you're really aware of these things, our emotions in real time at that moment, we can actually have more choices on how to proceed. Okay, but take note, all of these three options require vulnerability, which is challenging when you're feeling hurt and misunderstood. You don't really want to put yourselves in a further disadvantageous situation when you try to disclose and make yourselves vulnerable. But remember, as they say, if there is no risk, there won't be any reward. And that is true also in trying to build exceptional relationships.